You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war. Today is March 21st, 2020, and the new coronavirus is just now starting to hit hard. 4 European countries and 5 states are in full lockdown, and we're starting to see hospitals overwhelmed with sick patients. I'm currently sheltering in place at home in New Mexico, and like so many others, I just lost nearly all my income. If you're listening to this today or tomorrow, you might not yet realize that nothing is ever going to be the same again. Not after this. New York and Washington are just a few weeks behind Italy, and the rest of us are not far behind them. How this plays out in the long run will depend on all of us. In crisis, there's opportunity. The threat of authoritarianism is greater than ever, but so is the likelihood of positive change, of an end to corporate greed and the establishment of economic policies that put people before profits. They may have stolen the primary again from Bernie, but Congress has just overwhelmingly passed a coronavirus relief bill that essentially proves Bernie was right. Where will we get the money to pay for Medicare for all? You're about to see where. It's going to come straight from the Treasury. You are about to see how easy it is to issue money directly into the economy without the need to raise taxes. $1 trillion to start. Brand new money created out of thin air and issued into the economy. Where will we get the money? There's not enough money. When you hear that line from politicians, you know they're working for Wall Street. The Wall Street banks don't want you to understand that money is constantly created out of thin air. They don't want you to know where money comes from. They want you to think that when you take out a loan, you're borrowing money from someone else that's worked hard to earn it and who deposited it in their bank. But that's not true. When you take out a loan from a bank, the bank creates the money out of thin air, issues it to you in the form of debt, and now you have to work for years to pay it back with interest. If the economy crashes and a lot of people can't pay their loans back, like happened in 2008, the banks then get the Treasury to bail them out with trillions of dollars of brand new money, also created out of thin air and given directly to the banks. Not to you. No, you get foreclosed on. You lose your house. Because where are we going to get the money to fund programs for the people, right? Well, in less than 2 weeks, you are very likely to receive a check from the U.S. Treasury for $1,000. It won't be enough to help most Americans. I know I can't pay my monthly bills on $1,000. But ask yourself where that money came from. There is no shortage of money. The question is only who gets it and how is it distributed. In France, they've just suspended all mortgages, all rents, all utilities, and they're giving people money to live on. Not to mention health care is free there. We need to do the same thing here. It's not hard, it's easy. But will our politicians do it? That's the only question. Right now, we have to do whatever we can to slow down the spread of this virus, which means shelter in place and don't go out unless you need to. But this is also time to start demanding federal relief, an end to the profit-driven healthcare system, and an end to a monetary system where banks create new money in the form of debt, sitting back and getting rich collecting our interest payments, money that we have to work for. This economic crisis, sparked by coronavirus, can only be solved by direct payments from the Treasury to the people and by suspending all debts to the banks. And the fact that we can do this proves our system can be changed permanently. So get ready to fight for structural change. Amidst all the sadness about to strike, recognize we also have the greatest opportunity we've ever had to make permanent, positive changes to our society. Okay. That's my rant. Now on to the episode. In this episode, I interview Brian Pace. Brian's a board member of the psychedelic nonprofit Psymposia and a co-host of Symposia's +3 podcast. He's also a plant evolutionary ecologist, and he lives and teaches university classes in Ohio. Brian recently wrote an article on psychedelics in the right wing called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, where he describes the political right's embracing and promotion of psychedelics. From fringe Nazi groups to corporate capitalists like Peter Thiel, in this episode, Brian and I discuss a range of issues pertaining to the mainstreaming of psychedelic drugs. You'll hear clips from an interview I did a few months ago with Rick Doblin from MAPS and their relationship with the U.S. military and the right-wing Mercer Foundation. We also talk about Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and all the rest of that fun podcast stuff people love to talk about, at least before coronavirus. I have to admit, I really don't know if any of this even matters anymore. I recorded this interview before the pandemic started, but for what it's worth, here it is. My interview with Brian Pace. I hope you enjoy it. Stay home and stay safe, everyone. Brian, thank you for being on the show. It's great to have you here.
Hey, thank you for having me. I've been a listener for a little while.
Oh, great. Awesome. So I'm bringing you on because you recently authored an article that's gotten a lot of play in the movement now. It's called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, Psychedelics and the Right Wing. I want to start by just asking you, what motivated you to write this article?
So this is something I've been chewing on for months. I would say even maybe even a year now. And there's a lot of factors. Many of the examples that I list in the article are essentially the motivations for writing this piece. And it was sort of a drip in terms of an accumulation of stories and other somewhat incongruent characters, showing up in the media stream and in my readings where, if you have Adam Waffen, for instance, a very extreme neo-Nazi group getting caught with psilocybin mushrooms and apparently discussing them and their significance. I thought that was interesting. But in terms of writing things on the internet, in some ways my motivations come from a place of annoyance at times because...
And so is it annoying you that right-wingers are using psychedelics and posting about them?
Not necessarily. That's not what I really want to say. What I mean in terms of annoyance is that I feel like there's something like incorrect. And so really this article came from a place of wanting to reorient, to have a discussion about something I care deeply about that is clear-eyed, with our feet firmly planted on the ground about what we can expect and what's actually happening. And so in science, investigating new systems, data that doesn't fit your model is often a chance to choose a different model. And so I found these, we could call them outliers, of individuals with right-wing ideologies using and sometimes extolling the benefits of psychedelics to be interesting enough to marshal together and meditate on and then hopefully start a conversation.
Okay, so am I correct in saying that the basic theme point of your article is that psychedelics do not inherently have a liberalizing impact on the people who use them, and then you are going through all these examples of right-wingers, from really extreme right-wingers to kind of more of these center-right YouTube figures, et cetera, as evidence of this thesis? Is that what your point is?
I would say that's fair. I think that's definitely part of what I'm, 80% of what I'm trying to communicate there is a reorientation to say that these are not necessarily antidotes to political beliefs that we don't like, that they aren't going to necessarily turn us all into anarcho-syndicalists as much as many of us would like to believe that. And in some ways, these are assumptions that are found more within the psychedelic community than without the psychedelic community. Speaking to your average person about such things, there's definitely an association of certain political beliefs and even style choices amongst the psychedelic community from those who haven't taken it. But this isn't necessarily a narrative that I think is out there in the broad world.
Why is it important that we talk about this? Why do you think it's important that people know that psychedelics alone aren't going to save the world?
Probably because there are many articles that are being written today that pose the question, can psychedelics save the world? And having stared down the barrel of climate change for more than a decade in my scholastic efforts, we can't be wasting our time on certain fantasies. We have to be practical when it comes to our approach to change the world.
Let's use psychedelics and fight the fascists. That's what you're saying. Not just spread psychedelics.
I mean, Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, let's fight fascism. Yes, of course, absolutely. And it's there's no time like the present, given the sense that well, it's rising not just in the United States but globally, and not just in the UK. But if anybody's paid attention to what's going on down in Brazil, the definition of a neo-fascist is in power. Bolsonaro. So I guess some of the individuals that I talked about are more in history, and some individuals that caught my eye on this that didn't make it into the article have firm intersections with fascism and
Let's talk about
intersections with the psychedelic community.
Let's talk about some of those people in your article first. Do you want to give us a short rundown of some of the right-wingers who have become proponents of psychedelics now?
Yeah, so I mean, I start off the piece basically talking about, neo-Nazis who have been arrested with either psilocybin, in the case of Adam Waffen, Division. They're kind of ghoulish nihilist cult Nazis that produce a lot of intentional. They're sort of the most unapologetic neo-Nazis out there.
I know nothing about them. How popular is this group?
I mean, let's just be straightforward and say that I think that Nazis are not particularly popular to begin with.
Well, that's good.
But they are organizing in a much more like unapologetic way than other groups. And it's something that I do address later in the article when I talk about entryism, and we can get to that later. But then there's the base. So just recently outside of in Virginia, there was a Second Amendment rally, and there were some extreme far-right elements that were organizing who were arrested on weapons charges. This international neo-Nazi organization called the Base was caught not only with a fully automatic machine gun, but also materials for, one can only assume, the extraction of DMT. So DMT smoking Nazis is the only thing that one can assume from that story. Starting with the neo-Nazis, I think, was important, particularly because there's a MAPS peace study going on where they're using ayahuasca to do, trauma work with Israelis and Palestinians. And it was part of this line of thought, of reasoning, where, all of these assumptions about the inherent goodness of psychedelics, that there's some kind of directionality in terms of how people who have taken psychedelics are going to end up being more progressive. And of course, we see some of this in the literature with the openness studies. And yet, when we think about some of the least open people that we can imagine, I would say neo-Nazis are a reactionary group that serves as a counterpoint. I think there's sort of there's an assumption that is playing out there that psychedelics are going to, play a huge role in changing the world. And I think that psychedelics have a role. I think they're a tool. They're a powerful tool. They're an underutilized tool. But in terms of what changes the world, I would say that structural political economy is that which rules our lives.
Hold on a second. These are really extreme, like fringe groups. And before we get to some of the more mainstream sort of center-right people that I think have even more popularly embraced and are popularizing psychedelics, like these cases are important to you because of this notion of entryism, where fringe cultures, whether they're political countercultures or not, tend to be more open in their membership. And what might be happening here is that some psychedelic counterculture movements may be allowing right-wingers to come in, and you talk about this guy Piper who writes about this. Talk about that.
So Alan Piper was definitely one of those influences for writing this piece. He wrote a piece in a monograph in 2014 called "Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows: The Politics of Psychedelics." And in it, he really focuses in on a couple of examples. With regard to entryism, he talks about this political strategy, usually for groups that, for one reason or another, are aware that their ideas need to be softened, or they're aware that they're simply unpopular. And so Piper talks about how psychedelia, for historical and other reasons, is a fringe subcultural movement. And as a result, in the last 60-odd years, we have seen those cast-offs from the far right and the far left rubbing shoulders. If you watch, for instance, the documentary Orange Sunshine, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love talks about how there was a shift where suddenly the Hells Angels were a part of their distribution network. And, these are extremely far-right organizations that played a role in the spread of psychedelics. So I use sort of a counterexample in the piece, talking about Milo Yiannopoulos, who is somebody who had a brief and bright career on the far right, but has sort of his star has fallen. In any case, because he is searching for new audiences, because a lot of people have essentially, he made some public comments essentially in support of pedophilia, and so he was persona non grata after that, even amongst conservative. It wasn't.
Yeah, he was an example of someone who's trying to enter counterculture with his right wing views and was blocked.
Yeah,
and then some historical examples you just gave of maybe Hell's Angels getting involved in dealing LSD. What are some modern examples of right wingers entering the psychedelic subculture?
Yeah, sure. So Piper talks about this, and I provided a link to a group called Hilung, and they say a comment on politics. This has been brought to our attention that
I love the band Hilung. I love them. They're great. Yeah. And so as I read, I did click on that hyperlink, and I read that there was some violence in their show where a black person got attacked, and they condemned it in this
right
post.
And so this is something that has happened in sort of the goth and industrial neo-folk kind of doomy world for a while, where there's as somebody who's listened to some of this music over the years, I've been like, for instance, I used to listen to Death in June as a early 20s person. This was well before you could just Google everybody's tweets and such, and it just took me a while. I was like, oh, these people are fascists, and so that would be an example of entryism, where somebody is just they're engaging artistically with fascistic aesthetic, but there's an intentional obfuscation of one's beliefs, and this is a process of ideological grooming, we could call it.
Yeah. So what are some examples today of right-wingers infiltrating or entering psychedelic countercultures? Is this happening in the psychedelic society? Like, are you saying in this piece, beware psychedelic society groups around the country? You may have fascists coming in there using psychedelics, and what do you believe in? You're going to allow them to take over your group, or should you saying kick them out? What are you saying?
So I think I'm careful to not necessarily. I mean, I think in a piece where I'm critical of people sort of externalizing their political aspirations into chemicals, I don't hide my own ideological leanings. I'm clearly
Neither
a leftist.
do I.
And so I think that it's important to own that and not assume that psychedelics are going to do the heavy lifting for us.
Right. Use psychedelics and fight the fascists at the same time.
Sure. And so in that sense, like, I wouldn't say that, in terms of subcultures, this is the biggest problem in the world. But in terms of mainstreaming, I end the piece talking about capitalism, because in terms of an ideology that's adaptive and dominant and has it's the hegemonic political system that is taking over, that has taken over our entire global economy. Capitalism is always seeking new markets. And in this case, what we're seeing is with decriminalization, a black market is turning into a legal market, And it's happening, as with cannabis, in a drip drip kind of way. And this is, attributable to how long it takes to get through the FDA, for instance. But a lot of the individuals that are involved, at least on the money side of this, can rightly be called extremely conservative forces in society. And so if we're talking about, entryism in the psychedelic community, we could start right there with Peter Thiel, with Rebecca Mercer, and these donors in the psychedelic space that have these incredibly right-wing beliefs.
Yeah,
that's the level that I'm concerned about most. We could talk about how annoying it might be to hear Jordan Peterson brought up in discussions of LSD, but that, I think, is a much more concerning one.
That's exactly what I want to talk about. Before we get into capitalism and its impact on psychedelics, let's continue with these right-wingers who are embracing them by shifting a little bit towards the more sort of middle-of-the-road, center-right people. And I want to go through them one at a time. You mentioned Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, and even Michael Pollan, who I don't think is necessarily right-wing, but it's sort of
definitely not. I would never claim such a thing.
Right.
Michael Pollan's a nice guy.
Well, maybe Sam Harris is a nice guy as well, but these other guys you mentioned are a bit towards the right.
And I want to correct myself here, because niceness should not be conflated with good politics.
Right.
So let's start with Jordan Peterson. So Jordan Peterson is somebody who's popped up on my radar because you have individuals in the psychedelic space sort of talking about everything from the role of masculinity to whether or not trans people should be respected in conversation. So Jordan Peterson is somebody that I definitely went down a big rabbit hole trying to understand what it is he's actually saying, and he's saying a lot. But one of the things that he says, he articulates quite well, the studies on psilocybin and mysticism and healthy normals. He refers to his own experiences with psilocybin, and has some stern warnings for that there be dragons there. He does talk a lot about dragons.
Dragons?
And so it was one of these. Oh yeah.
What does he mean by that?
He's a Jungian. He's a Jungian, so he means the dragon of the soul. And so I guess if there's a concern about the ideological context of, say, for instance, these YouTubers with huge influence, and Jordan Peterson absolutely has huge cultural cachet, or at least has had huge cultural cachet recently. And so, there were studies with LSD that showed that, one of the ways that psychedelic therapy works is that these substances make you suggestible, which is another way of saying they make you a little gullible. And so if somebody like Jordan Peterson or somebody like Sam Harris or Joe Rogan is presenting psychedelics to you, and you are 19, you're 16, and you are getting, maybe you went out and tried psilocybin as a result of your interaction with this digital media, and you had one of those incredibly opening or just wow experiences, whether it's a dissolving of one's boundaries with nature, or some kind of personal healing of trauma, or just a galactic consciousness expanding fucking trip. You then go back to the source of where you got that information, and you might be primed to hear whatever else they might be selling.
So are you concerned that right-wingers or capitalists or intolerant anti-trans YouTubers like Jordan Peterson are utilizing psychedelics as a weapon, intentionally or not, but that these substances will make you more suggestible, and then they will implant these right-wing ideas in you, and based upon association of your wonderful LSD trip and the fact that you first heard about it from Jordan Peterson, you're going to become more right-wing, and so therefore maybe we as the left should do that same thing and continue to try to associate psychedelics with radical leftism and anti-imperialism. And
so there's a lot going going on there. I'd like to engage with what you just said. So, I mean, when it comes to these kinds of things about, whether or not Jordan Peterson has said nice things about psychedelics, like I used to have rather conspiratorial beliefs about the world. It's one of the reasons why I got into science, is to learn how to sort good information from less good information.
A lot of real conspiracies out there, just so you know.
I'm aware. I am.
Anyway, go ahead.
Conspiracy actually is a crime. It's something you can be prosecuted for. So in any case, what I'm trying to say is not that I believe there is an intentional, nefarious weaponization of psychedelics to soften up one's audience. But I would make it a comparison to, say, the men's rights affiliated group, the Pickup Artist Community. Are you familiar with them? They had a moment for a while there where they even had like a reality show with this guy Mystery, who would teach young men who were unlucky in love how to believe in themselves and put their best foot forward and have a nice, makeover and go for their dreams and go after the woman that they wanted, or every woman in the room. And all of that was some really good sort of empowerment, kind of just do it kind of mentality, packaged with a whole fuck ton of toxic masculinity, where it says, you have to break down the ego of a woman. So the best way to do that is to neg her. And, there's all this sort of really to neg. It's an incredibly nerdy subculture where they use a lot of jargon. But to neg is to say something negative about somebody. It's essentially a backhanded compliment. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but to say that there are whole meme complexes where individuals are putting together sort of a coalition of ideas and then selling the whole package to various audiences. That's definitely something I am concerned about, because a lot of times if you get something valuable from an actor, from an intellectual, from some kind of personality, you're much more likely to be open to anything else they might be selling.
Yeah, so going back, we should be doing this on the left, right? We should be overtaking these right-wing YouTubers by putting out our own podcasts and YouTube videos associating psychedelics with anti-imperial viewpoint.
I have a podcast right now, a Psymposia called +3, where we certainly explore anti-capitalist ideas and their intersection with psychedelia. So yes, and the idea here is that we need to be clear that these are tools and that they are not going to directionally push one in one place or another. And so when I think about some of these other individuals that I spend time with in the piece, so Sam Harris.
Oh yeah, let's talk about Sam Harris.
Sam Harris is somebody who probably single-handedly revivified the debate about a man who, really hadn't been part of pleasant conversation in a while, which is Charles Murray. Charles Murray is somebody who wrote The Bell Curve. He was funded by the Pioneer Foundation, which is a eugenicist organization that wants to fund narratives about all of that regressive ideas. It's practically phrenology. And he's a skilled statistician, so he dug into the IQ literature. But there's been a whole lot of critique of Charles Murray from evolutionary biologists like myself, psychologists, and Sam Harris went a long way to bringing his ideas back into conversation. And these ideas, they don't have intellectual merit. And I would say that this is an example of Sam Harris using what we can call strategic controversy to drive his name into fame. He brought Charles Murray onto his show because Charles Murray had some sort of unpleasant experience on a college campus where he was protested, and Sam Harris said, well, this is just another example of the regressive left coming along and suppressing honest debate.
So your critique here, Sam Harris is kind of the center-right guy, like Jordan Peterson's, very critical of the campus left, but yet he's also promoting psychedelics. I read his book. To be honest, I've never listened to his podcast, but I did read his book, Waking Up.
Right.
He's one of these kind of neo-Darwinist atheists type of
new atheism,
guys.
militant. Yeah.
But I liked his book. I thought, wow, I want to, it's about it's about meditation, and it's like, and I'm a meditation practitioner, and thought, oh, well, if I know some atheists, this would be the book I'd give them to try to get them to start meditating, because like sort of meditation without God or whatever. And he opens his book. He actually opens Waking Up with his MDMA experience that he paints in a very glowing light and all. And so this is one of the examples of sort of the center right person who is advocating psychedelics and at the same time advocating some ideologies that we don't really agree with, and that's upsetting. But it just points to the fact, and again, this may be all you're saying in your article, it just points to the fact that there's nothing inherently liberalizing about psychedelics. And I like to take it to the next level. Like, so what do we do about that? Because I'm left and I want to push people towards the left, right? So what's the next step in that regard? Like, first we get psychedelic proponents to realize there's nothing inherently radical politically about spreading psychedelics. So then what do we want them to do?
I mean, I generally advocate for decriminalization across the board. Portuguese models, I think, are good. I think that I'm extremely leery of these sort of advanced commercialization plans that we're seeing bubbling up right now. People have entire pitch decks for how we're going to get microdosing back into your Whole Foods health aisle. And
right, I think this is a good segue then to go into the next topic I wanted to talk to you about. Actually, is what are the repercussions of capitalism's embracing of psychedelics? Why is it so bad that psychedelics become mainstream and capitalism embraces them, and we have for-profit psychedelic centers or retreats?
Yeah. So in the piece, I sort of point to this really interesting kind of storybook style discussion of the mainstreaming, the medicalization, and then the marketing of psychedelics called We Will Call It Pala. And this sort of storybook, it's almost drawn, I would say, in the style of Randall Munroe from XKCD. And it discusses a lot of the idealism behind many of the well-meaning folks who have put their fortunes, their marketing talents, their communication skills towards rehabilitating psychedelics to the broadest audience possible. And that's something that's happened, with MAPS. MAPS decided that they would push back against the sort of cultural hangover we've all been having from the 60s by approaching the military to sell MDMA. And I mean sell MDMA as an idea, as to rehabilitate the idea culturally. But in We'll Call It Pala, it games things out in somewhat Black Mirror fashion in the future, where this has been won. This battle is now done. Let's imagine that we're actually 5 years past MAP's temporary exclusivity of the use of MDMA and PTSD therapy. It's an open field, maybe even a little bit further, and so psilocybin is now in the mix. And so what we're seeing internationally right now with these retreats, whether it be synthesis or rhythmia, all of these different places that you can go in either Costa Rica or the Netherlands or Brazil to take everything from mushrooms to ayahuasca is usually the common ones. These different retreat centers, they've got polished websites, they have more or less woo to them, and there's competition that's going on. And in We'll Call It Pala, it essentially starts to argue that this capitalistic Walmartification of a kind of a strip mall psychedelia is something that we should actually expect. Because when we treat these things as a commodity, there's certain things that we know very well are likely to happen in a capitalist economy.
What's wrong with the Walmartification of psychedelics? What's going to happen?
Well, I would say what's wrong with Walmart. In that case, you have the exploitation of labor. You have cutting corners every quarter to increase profits. You have the stripping out of the ability of local control to do anything to improve conditions.
Have we seen this? How have we seen this happening already in the mainstreaming of psychedelics?
So in discussing, like, we will call it Paula, none of this has happened, at the level that we're talking about.
Let me interrupt you. Is this a book?
Yeah, sure.
We call it Paula.
So it's a website. It's put out by the Arun Fund. And so these are players in the game that, have put together a very thoughtful critique of the commodification of psychedelics. For instance, they have this. I'm looking at one of their graphics right now, and it's an imagination of a job listing. It says, "We are looking for loving hands," and there's some nice graphic, and it says, "Eleusinian Mental Health is hiring caregivers and home health aides to be loving hands care professionals who hold space for clients receiving psychedelic treatment. No experience necessary. Details: $19.50 an hour starting pay. Training and orientation included. Free ebook on, quote, holding space." And then there's a little asterisk, and it says, "Eleusinian therapists monitor treatments through video feeds and support loving hands through audio on Bluetooth headsets."
Okay, so yeah, there's some distaste in the way capitalism will co-opt and commodify everything. But what about the argument that the mainstreaming of psychedelics is needed to end the drug war and prevent people from getting arrested for these things, and to create a legal market that is not adulterated so people aren't dying from counterfeit MDMA or LSD, right? And that we just need to accept these capitalists that are going to go and do that, and there's going to be your rich housewives who spend thousands of dollars for an MDMA treatment in some capitalist center, but that's not going to stop the rest of us from taking our psychedelics at festivals and doing it with friends and listening to music and having the good time that we do anyway, right? So
that would assume that we've actually won with regard to decriminalization, and we haven't slipped into a fully medicalized paradigm where a lot of the bureaucratic controls are placed around these substances, where we have, sort of a walled garden put up around MDMA that persists for another 50 years in culture.
But, it could be argued that we are already in the midst of a drug war. If some drugs become legal for certain avenues, that's not going to increase the crackdown against people who use it outside of those contexts. It's only going to soften public opinion.
There's actually some evidence in Colorado that when things were legalized recreationally, arrests of people of color, teens who were smoking cannabis but not 21, went dramatically through the roof.
I read those things too. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
Let's talk briefly about some of the ways that these things are being sold. I believe his name's Christian Angermeyer. He's one of the major funders behind the efforts of the legalization of psilocybin, the medicalization of psilocybin. And when he talks about his own experiences, first of all, he says, "Well, I've never drank a drop. I've never smoked a cigarette. I've never taken a drug because I'm a super genius, and I'm just somebody who's very, very rich and very put together and such. But what I did do is, on my 40th birthday, I took my yacht and I went to the international waters outside of a country. We can only assume it was probably Jamaica or something, where psilocybin was legal. And there, in that legal context on my yacht, I took psilocybin and I saw the light, and I decided to put all of my efforts towards legalizing this important substance." Now, I focus in on that anecdote because it situates Angermeyer in this way where he says, "Well, I have broken no laws. I have found the insight of these substances, but of course I did it through the right way. And as a result, I am going to put together a framework that creates a bunch of clinics, and I'm not going to at any point challenge the efficacy and the necessity of laws around psychedelics, because I'm going to need those to protect my business model. Because last time I checked, psilocybin mushrooms grow from shit without any assistance from anyone, and they're quite easy to grow too much. You talk to anybody who's grown mushrooms and they end up giving them away to people. There's so many of them.
Doesn't that, though, I hear what you're saying, but doesn't that, though, make it impossible really for anyone to monopolize the magic mushroom industry?
I think so I actually mentioned earlier this concept of hegemony, which is a concept by Antonio Gramsci. He was imprisoned by the fascists, and he talked about hegemony as being integral to maintaining control of any paradigm. And hegemony is hearts and minds. It's how we think about the world. It's in many ways, this is what education is it's a part of our obedience training that allows us to accept things as they are. And so, one of the reasons why we say that some say mainstreaming is important is to address that cultural hegemony and change the narrative. But if one changes that narrative to a medicalization paradigm, the idea that you have to go through your insurer to do a $5,000 treatment to take psilocybin when you could just take it with your friends, people who actually know you and care about your troubles, that could be discouraging.
Well, yeah, I fully agree with you. I have all along been a proponent of recreational use of these substances, and the recreational use is the most therapeutic use. Therapy and recreation can't be separated, and the best form of therapy is when you're among people in your community, your friends, your family, etc., right? But I don't see how they're ever going to monopolize mushrooms or cannabis or any of these substances. And you're worried about a paradigm of capitalistic medicalization that stops people from using them at festivals. And I just don't think that's going to happen. That doesn't mean we should not kind of fight against the commodification of these substances, but I think it's less of a worry than some people think.
I mean, I wouldn't say that I stay up late at night worrying about that. I would just say that the entrance of certain individuals who would like to commodify psychedelics, they're using a legal paradigm that they need.
Yeah.
When we could, in fact, have the power and the cultural soapbox to talk about these substances with the intent of decriminalizing them so no one goes to jail for them.
I fully agree with that. That's
under any context.
And not just psychedelics, but all drugs. And you say that in your article, and that's one of the...
and we say that on the Plus 3 podcast over and over again.
I agree with that so much. I've actually discouraged the psilocybin decriminalization groups from focusing solely on psilocybin. I mean, I'm glad that it's happened, but I'm like, come on, what we need is to pass laws state by state that decriminalize all drugs. And
I agree.
We actually have a majority in our country. Every survey in every state has a majority of people on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, supporting the decriminalization of all drugs.
Yeah. So I would say that something I argue for towards the end of the piece, and also I think serves to explain some of the reasons why I wrote the piece, is that if there is this assumption that psychedelics are going to, by themselves, if we simply distribute them quite a bit, that by themselves is going to somehow make the world a better place, that on its own serves as a disincentive for some of the people in the psychedelic community who are often quite educated, quite privileged, to dissociate themselves from broader struggles for necessary change. Personally, I think it's terrible that people are still dying from fentanyl in my city, and everywhere. But like I live in Columbus, Ohio.
You're in the epicenter of the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah, we are vying for second or first place of fentanyl deaths, in the country.
Yeah.
So I would say the abdication of the psychedelic community to have solidarity with those organizations is upsetting to me. I would say the same about the climate movement. regardless of how much of this literature about psychedelic experiences making us more likely to express environmentalism as a belief. Whether or not that's a sampling issue, who knows? But the idea that that discourse is out there when we should be, I don't know, I would say arguing for the 100 most polluting companies in the world to be tried for crimes against humanity. Yeah, that's what I would advocate for. So in some ways, I would like to see those who are involved in these drug decriminalization narratives to take broader interest in solidarity with other groups.
Yeah, especially when it comes to ending the drug war, right? Like, I'm going to be giving a talk at the Utah Psychedelic Society next week, and they wanted me to talk about, how the psychedelic movement can fit into the broader drug policy reform movement. And I think that's really, really important. We've all been going to the same conferences forever now, and the majority of people at these conferences are either loved ones of they're either opioid users or loved ones of opioid users who have died or who are in prison for using non-psychedelic drugs. And they're trying to end the prison industrial complex. They're trying to save lives by promoting harm reduction. And then you got the MAPS people that are there promoting psychedelics, and they meet and they talk to each other. But really, there's very little working overlap between these movements. And I think the decriminalization of all drugs is a way in which we can work together and come at it from both sides. From the cognitive liberty side, I should be allowed to change my consciousness if I want to, which is the psychedelic kind of side of the argument for decriminalization, but also the harm reduction side. We need to decriminalize and stop arresting people from using, meth and cocaine and opioids so that we can open up the public conversation, provide services to these people, do drug checking, increase the purity of the market, quality control, and save lives that way. So
but this is one of the reasons why when it comes back to discussions of capitalism, talking about, say, Peter Thiel's involvement in Compass Pathways as a major funder is deeply problematic. I mean, the man also has a company called Palantir. And when 600 immigrants were deported from Mississippi, these are undocumented individuals. How were they found by the government if by definition they don't have this kind of documentation? It was through using Palantir's technology, where they were triangulating through people's social networks. And I think that the idea of this organization that's data hungry and extremely antisocial, I would say, being welcomed into the halls of psychedelic investment and research and such is one of those things where it starts to undermine the credibility of other organizations and their commitment to these broader questions about being anti-war and ending the prison industrial complex. These are big issues.
All right. This might be a good time for me to play for you a recent interview I had with Rick Doblin, executive director of MAPS, about this very topic. So I'll play. There's two clips I want to play for you. So let me play this for you. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of criticisms of MAPS and, of course, Compass and the for-profit organizations who are working towards the mainstreaming of psychedelics. That the mainstreaming of psychedelics will remove the pro-social justice or anti-U.S. imperial awareness that kind of grew up with LSD in the 1960s, that all this is going to kind of ruin the counterculture of psychedelics that they feel is very important. The awakening to we're all one, we need to end war.
Well, I think you can be awakened to all one or end war without being counterculture. In fact, our whole point is that we're trying to change the mainstream culture. We're trying to mainstream psychedelics, we're trying to mainstream a more universal appreciation in our culture. It shouldn't be the dominant culture is anti-immigrant and everybody who's in the minority that's all one is a counterculture. We want to change the core of the culture, and that's what we need to be doing. And I think the fact that the research will one day move, hopefully, to prescription use, assuming phase 3 works out, that doesn't take away the power of this to help people work through their own prejudices, other people's the impact of other people's prejudices on them. So I think that whole kind of criticism seems misplaced to me, that we're trying to heal people from their trauma so that they can see more clearly, not be prisoners of the past, be more open, be more alive. And I think that will be very helpful. And so I don't see that as a compromise with the forces of repression.
Okay, what do you think about that? What's your response to Rick?
I mean, those are, I would say, some glittering generalities is the technical term for that kind of propaganda. And I don't want to say that is in a like a mean way to Rick Doblin. Rick
Propaganda,
he's a talented speaker. But when it comes down to the idea that, we can be awakened to the all one and not necessarily be counterculture when we live in a total war economy. I mean, when was the last time the United States was not at war? We're talking over 20 years at this point.
Actually, my whole lifetime, and I'm 50, because
Sure.
the Cold War was still a hot war in the sense that our proxies were out there killing people.
Yes. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about Afghanistan, our currently longest war in history. So the idea that being awakened to the idea that war is wrong, that is somehow something that can still fit into the mainstream, I would take issue with that. I would also say that, playing both hands, it's kind of like, I guess my head goes back to the Israel and Palestine kind of situation where the United States has eroded its ability to be a neutral arbiter because they clearly have sided with one of those actors. And when you take a lot of money from the Mercers, an organization that, Robert Mercer is the big funder behind Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica weaponized big data to give us Donald Trump and to facilitate Brexit. These are organizations that are invested in war making. And so I think that it's hard to play both sides of that coin. So,
what I hear Rick saying there, in a sense, is that it's okay to take this money. It's okay to work with the capitalists and the military and to mainstream psychedelics because he still believes that mainstreaming psychedelics is going to have this awakening effect on people and make the world a better place. And in other words, he still believes his initial...
in the inherent good of these substances.
That's right. But and this is what you critique directly in your article, that the substances themselves are not going to inherently awaken people.
I think there's plenty of evidence of that being the case.
Okay, but let's listen to this second clip, because now I hear Rick actually contradicting himself when I get into more details and talk about the military. So listen to this. Well, I agree with you. And one of the things I tell people is I've interviewed half a dozen or so veterans who went through MDMA therapy, and none of them would ever go back to war again.
Well, there was one veteran in our study who was on reserves and was called up a couple months after the study and went back. So I don't think that it's this idea that everybody takes MDMA and now they're all peace and love and, they want to leave the military. I don't think it's that way at all.
So you agree with some of your critics then that maybe PTSD could help the military make better soldiers?
Better soldiers is not a bad idea. More humane soldiers, less prone to just, shoot people out of reflexive fear, more thoughtful, more aware of the emotional consequences.
But that's not what the military thinks of better soldiers. When you go through boot camp, they try to tear down your sensitivity and make you into more of a killing machine, right?
Yeah, but they still want you not to commit war crimes. And I think that the more you end up... so I do believe that it's an individual choice. We want to heal people. If they want to go back to the military or if they want to leave, that's their choice. And that the therapy is not valued by whether they leave or stay the military. It's we've got people that are suffering. We want to help them.
Well... Yeah. Okay, but we know, Rick, that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were based on false intelligence, right?
Yes, the point is that there's civilian leadership of the military, And so there's something noble about saying I'm going to place my, I'm going to protect others and place my life at risk. The decisions, the wars, we need to focus on politics, not on the soldiers themselves. So they say, love the soldier, hate the war. So for those people that are concerned about how we're using the military, the thing to do is to work politically to change things. It's not to say we're not going to help the soldiers who are suffering. We're not going to provide them with therapy.
Okay, all right. So what's your response to that?
I mean, the thing that jumps out to me more than anything is individual choice is invoked in just about any discussion that I can think of about the merits of capitalism. And the critique of the cooperation with the military and the use of psychedelics in that context it's structural. So the idea that healing individual soldiers in one of the most hierarchical organizations in the world is going to somehow trickle up and change the war fighting priorities of the American imperial machine. I don't just buy it. I think that it's almost a disingenuous discussion of the reality of what this institution does in the world. So the idea of healing soldiers, that's good. But when we heal soldiers, I think that war is a crime. So the idea that MDMA is going to put soldiers back out on the battlefield and they're going to be less likely to commit war crimes, I don't. Let's just say I don't buy it. I think that there are a lot of ways that soldiers operating have been manipulated in a variety of context into committing war crimes. But I think that there is a logic there that it's actually refreshing to see Rick Doblin acknowledge, which is that, the military will weaponize anything they get their hands on. And once MDMA therapy is legalized, we can't really say exactly under what context one can go through this therapy. And if you're, say, a drone pilot who has the military has invested quite a bit in your training, and you get some kind of PTSD experience a year and a half into your tour of duty, and a $10,000 treatment can get you back in that seat, I don't see anybody arguing convincingly that the military won't be doing that.
So I have a slightly different take on this.
Great.
And I think really Rick believes that psychedelics make people more liberal, more open. He's always talked about wanting to mainstream psychedelics to make the countercultural values that he has had his whole life. And that doesn't just include doing LSD. He was a draft dodger in Vietnam. It's an anti-war attitude. He's had these his whole life. He really does believe that if we bring these substances into the mainstream, that they are going to have a positive impact on the world. He's talked about the positive impact it can have on the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, right? All of this. He believes in them. He doesn't believe that they are politically neutral substances. But yet he couldn't admit in the second clip I played for you that soldiers with PTSD who undergo MDMA treatment are going to refrain from going back to war. And he talks about a reservist who would have been breaking the law, by the way, if he didn't go back and serve.
True.
And so I think his unwillingness to say that is simply because in his effort to mainstream psychedelics, he is reaching out towards the right wing and trying to get them to embrace that. And the notion that psychedelics, or just say specifically MDMA and MDMA treatment for PTSD in veterans will make those veterans less likely to fight, would alienate people like the Mercers. So he's unwilling to say it, but probably somewhere deep inside he actually believes it. And here's what I'm going to say. I think that soldiers will be far less likely to go back and fight after they have cured their PTSD or reduced their symptoms through MDMA therapy. And the reason I believe that is because I believe PTSD is a moral identity crisis. PTSD results in individuals who have interpreted their trauma in such a way to blame themselves. And that means people that get PTSD have a conscience. And part of the way that MDMA heals PTSD is by allowing a person to forgive themselves and come to terms with why they did what they did. And all the veterans that I interviewed who went through MDMA therapy all talk about how part of their PTSD was directly involved with the fact that they were lied to about the wars. And they had to come to terms with that. And none of them were willing to go back and fight.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there's definitely an argument, and obviously you've interviewed enough of these individuals to have evidence that that is the case for some folks. I think that we often underestimate how adaptive capitalism is. And so the protocols that are currently being used in the PTSD therapy with MDMA, they're geared in a certain way, and that's something that is approved by the FDA. So I actually don't know exactly how rigid that will be. But I will say that I would say 90% of pharmaceuticals find off-label usage within 6 years, I believe, is the statistic. So the idea that this wouldn't happen, that we wouldn't start tailoring MDMA therapy in the future, I would say it's certainly possible. Now, in the context of the military is an incredibly adaptive institution. And let's just say that, like, when it came to the MK Ultra studies, there was attempts to use all kinds of substances to brainwash spies and erase their memories and interrogate them.
But the psychedelics didn't work. And I think MDMA is not working. I think the very reason that the military is not embracing MDMA is because they've looked at these cases and they've realized that these people who are being cured of their PTSD, they're not helping us send them back to war. They're not willing to go back to war. But Rick is still trying to be politically neutral by pretending that MDMA could help the military itself somehow rather than just helping soldiers.
So with MK Ultra, to say that the psychedelics didn't work, that may be correct, at least in most of the stated objectives of MK Ultra. But to say that the military didn't learn valuable lessons on how to terrorize, manipulate, control individuals using drug and other kinds of psychotropic combinations, if you read through some of the things that have leaked out of Guantanamo, there are all kinds of things that directly came from MK Ultra that are still being used by the military. And so I use that as an example to say that if there are settings in which the current MDMA therapy protocols can be tweaked by the military to create a more efficient warfighting force, you can 100% guarantee that they will be tweaked in that direction.
Yeah, if it's capable of being used that way.
Well, MDMA has certain characteristics that could be called fear extinction. And there are certainly contexts where in warfighting scenarios, performance-enhancing drugs are used by the military. Dexedrine's being used by fighter pilots. There's all kinds of substances that are being used as a particular tool in a particular situation. Now,
you're confusing that though. Really, like seriously here. Like,
okay.
When you take MDMA and it reduces your fear, what it's really doing is making you less capable of perceiving when there are threats against you. They've done studies that showed this very clearly. The ability to recognize threats is reduced on MDMA, and that doesn't make you into a better fighter. It's not making you feelers in the sense of making you into a more vigilant fighter because you're not scared to get in a fight. It actually makes you less likely to recognize when a fight is needed. I understand what you're saying, and David Nichols in my interview with him previously said the same thing, but I think it's just quibbling. We fully agree that the military would use anything it could to enhance its fighting abilities. I just think MDMA is not very useful in that regard.
I mean, ultimately, we will see. So, I mean, that's the thing is that the idea that, well, first of all, the military has already invested in this direction. So we know that there's interest.
The bigger question to me here we have MAPS allying with right-wingers and the military. And what impact is that going to have on both the psychedelic advocacy movement, the broader drug policy reform movement, and the more important movement for peace and justice in the world?
Yeah. So I mean, I used to work in a scenario where there was a lot of discussion of fundraising strategy for NGOs, and there was a man that I worked with who had funded a children's hospital entirely through donated funds and such. And there's a broader discussion we can have about philanthropy being used to launder the reputations of billionaires and other high net worth individuals, where a small amount of what they've taken from society is given back to essentially paint a nicer picture. We can think
Right.
of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, people who benefited from tremendous human suffering, but now have a number of buildings with their names on it.
And there's also a way that philanthropy is used to set limits on the narrative that liberal nonprofits are willing to go, right? So
Right.
the Ford Foundation funds Democracy Now!, for example, which may or may not prevent them from being too radical on certain topics. And we've seen this before. There's just generally a danger when you get your money from certain entities that you no longer want to offend those entities. And I think this is the trap that Rick is in right now. He's allied with right-wingers, and so he has had to tame his radical consciousness and his awareness and his beliefs. And this is why we see some contradictions in what he's saying. He really believes that psychedelics, rightly or wrongly, he believes that they're going to make the world a better place on their own inherently. And so therefore we need to mainstream them. And in mainstreaming them, he's approached and is working with people who don't share his values. And now
this can cause real harm because Naomi Klein, as she argues in This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, she talks about how Big Green has been a tremendous barrier to real concrete advancement on dealing with reducing carbon and advancing a radical change in our economic structure that is necessary for the preservation of civilization, the primary net productivity of our ecologies. And she points to the way that these organizations like the Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy have been co-opted by industry groups, and how their messages have shifted away from things that are, well, strategies that would materially improve the situation with regard to mitigating climate change as it stands. And I would say that the same thing is going on.
You mean cap and trade isn't going to save the world? Cap
and trade is not going to save the world. It's certainly not going to save Florida. I'll say that. But so I guess the critique of those who would like to take this kind of dirty money to get it done quicker is, well, what are we getting done again? And I mean, in this case, I guess we're getting done some MDMA therapy for PTSD. And I mean,
just so people know, I think you might already know, we talked about it before the interview. The long-term strategy conversations in the early days of MAPS have always been about full-on legalization for recreational use as well. And the medical model was chosen because it was thought to be easier to get past, that it would soften public opinion, and then 15 years later, after medical legalization and public opinion became softened, then laws could get passed for the full-on legalization, or at least decriminalization. This has been Rick's position and the Rick's board, et cetera, for a long time. The question is going to be, does he stick with that, or is these alliances he's making with the far right going to prevent MAPS, at least, from working on those broader goals?
I think there's an extreme naivete in terms of thinking that MAPS is going to be steering the ship for much longer. When we bring this kind of money to the table, when we're talking about the individuals who have strategized out for a generation in some cases as to how to corner a market. Peter Thiel does not believe in competition. Okay, even though he's the arch libertarian, he has stated that as a business strategy, allowing it and not crushing it is stupid, and he's right. If that's what you want to do. If you want to make the most money possible, why would you ever want competition?
You're not going to want to decriminalize mushrooms if your business plan is selling $1,000 mushroom trips to people.
Who wants to kill the the goose that lays the golden egg?
Yeah.
No one. And so these are the individual, like, this is the hazard of featuring, of putting up on a platform, of giving a giant spotlight, of sharing a conference with somebody like Tim Ferriss, who, I would say Tim Ferriss has stated that he doesn't want to directly profit from psychedelics, but we'll see. But the idea that these people who have demonstrated that throughout their life profit is their main motive, to invite them to steer the ship, they're going to take the reins.
What can we do to stop them?
So at Plus 3, we provide counter narratives, where I have been a psychedelic cheerleader for a long time. I have said psychedelics are an inherent good. I think that we should all take them. And I am, tempering my claims and saying, well, these are tools and they have good sides and bad sides. And the best way that we can engage with them is through community models that are focused on harm reduction and education, and that are embedded with broader efforts for positive social change. Now, I mean, we can talk all day about what those changes are. And I mean, I end this article saying, we should advocate for our beliefs rather than projecting them onto psychedelics. Somebody recently, Gail Bradbrook, with Extinction Rebellion, which is an organization that advocates for direct action to prevent further climate change, climate crisis havoc. She caught a bit of criticism and flack for arguing for the merits of broad psychedelic civil disobedience, that we should all somehow wasn't clearly defined, but that we should all go out and show up at some place at some time and have a kind of a psychedelic smoke out, and that coupled with climate efforts would be transformative. And I would put that a little bit in the overstated exuberance. Right. That said, in interviews with Gail Bradbrook, and I have all the respect in the world for Extinction Rebellion and all the work that she's doing, she provided a much more nuanced discussion of her own relationship with psychedelics, where she discussed how they were really valuable tools for dealing with burnout. And as somebody who's dealt with, just the existential grief of looking at what climate change has already done and having a pretty good idea of what it's likely to do in the next 50 years, in the next 100 years, that it's the poorest of the poor who will be affected, who are being affected first and most extremely. To have tools to allow activists to heal and to restore, and to strategize in a synthetic and complex way, that's valuable. And we should talk about that. We should properly contextualize and sell these products on their merits, to use a turn of phrase that I now regret. If we're talking about psychedelics, let's talk about their benefits and their drawbacks. They can make you a little gullible, a little loopy, maybe more into horoscopes or something, but they can also give you a much better picture of existential matters of life and death and what we value.
Brian, got to close this up, but I wanted to ask you. You had mentioned you may be doing a follow-up article to your Lucy in the Sky with Nazis.
You're going to lock me into it here, huh?
When might we see that?
Oh, man, I'm definitely not answering that follow-up question.
Okay.
So, yeah, I definitely got some pushback from people who were extremely mad that I may have mischaracterized their favorite podcasters. And this sort of was a convergence of two pieces, where I had originally was thinking that I might, address some of the folks in the intellectual dark web. There's a guy named Dave Rubin who does the Rubin Report. And he's done collaborations with Joe Rogan, or at least he's a fellow traveler with Jordan Peterson, like quite literally opens for him. And whether or not Rubin has actually talked about his own psychedelic use, I don't think he's been open about it. But he's had a lot of these folks who have on his show. Dave Rubin has gone and recorded a video in support of Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, essentially saying, yeah, it's great that Bolsonaro went and cleaned up some of these Marxists who were taking over the university. By clean up, he means raided universities and arrested people for thought crime. So the idea that these individuals are psychedelic adjacent does give me concern. And I think that, so I cite Becca Lewis's Data and Society report, the Alternative Influence Network, where she essentially makes a very strong case that somebody like Joe Rogan, that folks in the intellectual dark web serve as the front door for the reactionary right. That there are people who have talked about their own radicalization process via YouTube who've said, yeah, I was watching Joe Rogan, then I started watching Jordan Peterson, then I was introduced to Stefan Molyneux, who's a eugenicist and a racist, and then after Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer seems pretty palatable.
Is this going to be the subject of your follow-up article?
I think that I'd like to touch on some of these things, but I mean, I would say the last article took me 8 months or so to really start to shape up. So I've got enough deadlines in my life. I've got a child coming along the way, so there's
that's right.
Things I've got
Congratulations. To do. Well, I do look forward to reading your next article when it does come out. Thank you very much, Brian, for being on the show and for the work that you do. I've been a big fan of Psymposia since its early days. I'm going to listen to more to your podcast now, the Psymposia Podcast +3, and maybe I'll have you back on the show again at some point in the future. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Emmanuel.